everyone, this is Ilina and welcome to another LDRS creative card video. In this video, I will show you how to create a watercolor bleed background. So I'm using the Crazy for Daisies stamp set, and I'll be using the Little Boy Blue ink pad to stamp on piece of watercolor paper. I'm using cold press Arches watercolor paper, but you can use any watercolor paper of your choice. So the reason I'm stamping with this pale blue ink, the Little Boy Blue, is so I can create that watercolor bleed background, like watercolor wash background, and then go back in my stamping tool and stamp again, emboss, and add more color. I'm using some watercolor markers. I'm using the Karin watercolor markers and different shades of blue, so I will just mix all those colors onto my background. So I just clean my stamp. It doesn't need to be perfectly clean. You may notice that I have some black spots from previously stamped. The reason I'm stamping it before I create my bleed background is so I can see where my images is and where I want that bleed to be. So it kind of gives me a little bit more control. I'm taping my watercolor panel onto a wood panel. So because I'll be doing wet on wet technique, I'll be adding a lot of water and drying with my heat tool. So to make sure that I can have that watercolor panel stay as flat as possible. You'll see it will wrinkle a little bit, but it's not too much. So I'm using clean water and a little bit larger brush. I'm just adding water and color around the images, kind of making sure that it fades out as it gets out of the images. So I'm just creating very light wash onto my background, heat setting it, well, drying it, and then I can go back and add more color if I want. That's what I'm doing here. I'm adding just different shades of blue, like blue and aquas, and just going around those images. So when we stamp again and we're going to emboss in silver, you will see that where that bleed is. Right now you can really see much because it's a very pale color, and it's not very visible after we have applied the color or the watercolor markers. Now I'm kind of drying it to make sure that after I apply the embossing powder, it doesn't stick to the wet areas. So I already had my stamp in the stamp positioning tool, and I'm going over with the Watermark ink, and I applied the anti-static powder. I'm stamping that because I'm using a cold press watercolor paper. I'm stamping this about 4 times to make sure that I have nice coverage. And I'm pressing nicely over the lid of the tool to make sure I have, again, even coverage. I'm adding that silver embossing powder. Now you can see where the image is, and heat setting it. So now we're done, and now I'm using a aqua brush, and I still have the palette from the background. I'm using the same colors to color the image. So there I had a spot of embossing powder that wasn't melted, so it was just gonna go in my aqua painter. So just heat set it really quickly so I don't damage my aqua or watercolor brush. So you can see here I'm just adding water and dropping ink, and I'm mixing different shades of blue. You can see how it varies. Next I'm going for the leaves. I'm using like aqua colored. It's unconventional, but I wanted to keep the blue, kind of the entire card to have that blue shade. Since my watercolor background, it's you can see that bleed is blue. So I'm just coloring those leaves, and next I'm adding darker, kind of building up that color for the center of the flower so that it stands out a little bit more. So I'm almost done here. I'm adding a little bit darker here and there. Next I'm using the dark wash jeans ink pad, and I smushed some onto an acrylic block, and with my watercolor brush I went and splattered onto my background. I'm putting that background on the side, and I was going to use this navy cardstock for my sentiment. And I'm using the Thinking of You sentiment from the same stamp set, Crazy for Daisies, embossing it in silver to coordinate our stamped image. Next, I'll use my paper trimmer to trim this into a strip. And then also I'm trimming my panel down to 4 by 5.25. Originally my piece of cardstock was 6 by 4.5. So I'm creating again my note card, and here decided that I wanted to go with a little bit different kind of blue. So I went with more like kind of powder cornflower blue, kind of more coordinated with the colors on my image. Next, I'm using the same cardstock to stamp the sentiment. Probably you've seen me in my previous video. This Thinking of You stamp, I had it cut in half, so I could do like in 2 rows. So here in the Misty, or in the stamp positioning tool, I kind of put those 2 parts together and stamped the whole sentiment into 1 line. Next, I trimmed it to size. I'm adding some foam adhesive on the back, and I'm using T-ruler to make sure that I adhere that nice and straight onto my panel. Next, what I'm doing, since it's a watercolor panel and it's kind of warped a little bit, I covered the entire thing using foam tape. So that way I'll make sure that it's nice and flat onto my card base. So we're almost done here. We're just adding finishing touch. I'm using some white rhinestones to add around the image for extra sparkle and extra interest. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and see you soon in another video. And don't forget to click on that subscribe now button. Thanks for watching. Bye.